I have refereed more than 400 professional matches in my career, and I can tell you the exact second that all of them stopped mattering. It was the 90th minute of the final day of the championship season. Hartbridge United needed a draw to be crowned champions, and I pointed to the penalty spot in front of 41,000 people who would spend the rest of their lives believing I had robbed them. What none of them knew, what I did not fully understand myself until the next morning inside a small, windowless room at the referee's headquarters, was that the decision had never really been mine. My name is Daniel Voss. I was 43 years old that spring, 11 seasons into a career on the top 2 divisions of English football, and by every measure that mattered to the people who assessed referees for a living, I was having the best season of my life. I had been shortlisted for international duty. My marks from match delegates were the highest in my group. I had earned through years of unglamorous, disciplined work the single biggest fixture of the domestic calendar outside the Premier League itself. Hartbridge United against Aston Field Rovers. Winner takes the championship title, loser drops into the playoffs and gambles their season on 2 more matches. It was the kind of appointment a referee waits a career for, and I had wanted it the way you want very few things after 40. Hartbridge with a story everyone in the country was writing about that April. A club from a town of 60,000 people, built on a shoestring budget by a manager named Colm Reyes, who had been sacked twice before anyone gave him a chance to prove what he could do with a group that actually believed in him. Their captain, a 29-year-old central defender named Marcus Doyle, had spent his whole senior career at the club, had turned down bigger offers twice, and had become, almost by accident, the face of a certain kind of loyalty that the modern game likes to talk about and rarely rewards. Aston Field Rovers were the opposite story. Bought 3 years earlier by an investment group out of Manchester, restructured from the boardroom down. They had spent more on wages in a single season than Hartbridge had spent in 5. Promotion for Aston Field was not just a football matter, it was written into investor projections. I did not know that on the day of the match. I would learn it, along with a great deal else, the following morning.
I arrived at the stadium 4 hours before kickoff, the way I always did. I ran my pre-match briefing with my assistants the way I had run it 100 times before, walking through offside protocols, VAR communication, the handling of flashpoints in a match this size. My senior assistant that day was a man named Marcus Webb, 36 years old, 7 years on the list, a good, technically sound official who I had worked with perhaps a dozen times and never had cause to doubt. I remember one thing from that briefing now that I did not think twice about at the time. When I mentioned Doyle's name, listing him as a player we should watch for his aerial presence at set pieces, Webb said quietly, almost to himself, that he knew exactly what Doyle was capable of. I asked him what he meant. He said only that he had followed Hartbridge for years. I did not ask why a man from Manchester would follow a club in the north of the country so closely. It was the kind of remark that means nothing until it means everything. The match itself for 89 minutes was as clean as a title decider that big is ever likely to be. Aston Field were technically superior, patient, comfortable in possession, but Hartbridge defended with the kind of desperate organization that comes from a group of players who understand exactly what is at stake. Doyle was immense. He won headers, he blocked shots with his body, he organized a backline that had no business holding out against wages 4 times its own. By the 85th minute, the score was 0-0, and a draw would have been enough for Hartbridge to lift the trophy on goal difference. I remember checking my watch and thinking, quite honestly, that I might get through the biggest match of my career without a single major flashpoint. I was wrong within 5 minutes. In the 90th minute, Aston Field swung a corner into the Hartbridge box. There was a crowd of bodies, the kind of crush that happens at every corner in every match played anywhere in the world. Doyle rose to compete for the ball, and an Aston Field forward went down inside the area. From my position, 25 yards away, and with 3 players blocking my direct line of sight, I saw contact, but I did not see clearly what kind of contact it was. This is the truth that I have to be honest about, because it is the truth that everything else in this story depends on. I did not see a clear penalty. What I had in that instant was my assistant referee's voice in my ear.
Marcus Webb came through on the radio before I had even processed what I had seen. He told me with total conviction that Doyle had led with his forearm across the forward's chest, that it was a stone-wall penalty, that he had a clean angle, and I should trust him. I want to be honest about something else here too, because it matters for what happened next. Trusting your assistant in exactly this kind of moment is not misconduct. It is the job. An assistant referee positioned on the goal line with a clear sight line into a crowded box is precisely the resource a referee is trained to rely on with his own views obstructed. I asked him twice to confirm. Twice he confirmed without hesitation, in a voice that did not waver at all. I blew my whistle and pointed to the penalty spot. What happened next I do not need to describe in detail, because you have already imagined it. Doyle's face, the disbelief that moved through the away end and through the crowd around it like a wave. Reyes on the touchline, both arms raised, screaming something I could not hear over 41,000 voices. Aston Field's forward, a 22-year-old named Tyler Nash, converting calmly in the very last kick of stoppage time. The final whistle 2 minutes later. Aston Field Rovers, champions of the championship, on the final kick of the final day on a penalty that I had not personally seen and had trusted a colleague to see for me. I want to tell you what the walk off that pitch felt like, because it is the last thing I clearly remember before everything changed. Stewards forming a line around me, security guiding me down the tunnel while Hartbridge supporters screamed things at me that I have heard before in a long career and had never once heard aimed at me with that particular intensity of grief. Doyle, to his enormous credit, did not scream. He simply stood in the tunnel as I passed and asked me one question. He asked if I had actually seen it. I told him the truth. I told him I had not seen it clearly myself, that I had relied on my assistant's angle, and that I stood by the process, even if I could not personally vouch for the contact. He looked at me for a long moment and said nothing else. That look stayed with me longer than any of the shouting did. By the time I reached the referee's room, my phone had over 200 notifications. Pundits on the post-match broadcast, replaying the incident from 4 different angles, disagreeing loudly with each other about whether there had been contact at all. Reyes, in his press conference, refusing to blame me directly, but saying carefully that he hoped the officiating bodies would look closely at how the decision had been reached. My match delegate, a calm, precise woman named Grace Okafor, who had overseen dozens of my matches over the years, told me only that there would be a standard review the following morning, as there was after every contentious decision in a match of this magnitude, and that I should go home and try to sleep. I did not sleep. I lay awake replaying the 90th minute over and over, and the one detail that kept surfacing, uninvited, was Webb's voice in that pre-match briefing, telling me he knew exactly what Doyle was capable of. I arrived at the National Referees Standards Board's regional office at 8 the next morning.
It is a plain building, nothing like the stadiums we work in, all fluorescent light and grey carpet tile, and I had been inside it perhaps 6 times in 11 years, always for routine review sessions that lasted less than an hour. Grace Okafor met me at the door with an expression I had not seen on her before. She told me the review that morning would not be routine. She told me the technical panel had already been through the technical transcripts overnight, cross-referencing them against broadcast footage, VAR camera angles, and Webb's own positional data from his tracking chip, and that there were discrepancies serious enough that the panel wanted to speak to both of us before the day's press statement went out. We sat in a room with 3 panel members and a recording device on the table between us. The senior panel member, a former international referee named Peter Cassidy, began by playing the broadcast footage of the incident from an angle none of us had seen the night before, a camera positioned high behind the goal that had not been part of the standard broadcast package, but had been supplied that morning by the stadium's own internal security system at the board's request. On that footage, slowed down, the contact between Doyle and Nash was visible with total clarity for the first time. Doyle's arm was down at his side. Nash had gone to ground under his own momentum, losing his balance as he twisted to meet the corner, with no forearm contact at all. There had been no foul. I sat very still and looked at Webb across the table. This was the first clue that it meant nothing a day earlier, and now meant everything. Cassidy asked Webb directly what he had seen from his position on the goal line. Webb said again that he had seen forearm contact, that he stood by his call. Cassidy played the footage from Webb's own assigned angle, the one his position on the line should have given him, and it showed the same thing the broadcast camera showed: no contact. Webb's face at that point had gone the color of the gray carpet under our feet.
Cassidy did something I had not expected. He asked Webb about his brother. Webb did not answer immediately, and in the silence that followed, Grace Okafor quietly explained to me, and I am telling you now only what she told the room, that the board's integrity unit had, as a matter of standard procedure following any title-deciding controversy, run a routine background check on both officials the night before. Webb's younger brother, it turned out, had been released from Hartbridge United's academy 9 years earlier at 16 years old, a decision made by the club's youth department at a time when Colm Reyes had not yet arrived and had nothing to do with it, but a decision that had ended a promising career before it began and had, according to people who knew the family, devastated the boy for years afterward. Webb had never once mentioned this connection to the board when he was appointed to the fixture, despite being required by protocol to declare any personal or family connection to either club involved in a match he was assigned to officiate. I want to be careful here, because I do not think Marcus Webb woke up that morning planning to hand a false penalty to a club his family had no grievance against at all. Astonfield were not the club that had wronged his brother. Hartbridge were. What Webb told the panel, once he stopped denying it and started explaining it, was something closer and more human than a conspiracy, and also more damaging for exactly that reason. He said he had convinced himself, standing on that goal line with the ball in a crowd of bodies, that he had seen what he expected to see, because some part of him, for 9 years, had wanted Hartbridge United to lose something the way his brother had lost something. He said it was not planned. He said that when it mattered, in the half-second it takes to key a radio microphone, he had not been honest with himself about what he actually saw, and once the words left his mouth, he could not take them back without destroying his own career on the spot. So he had held the lie through my 2 questions, through the 90th minute, through the walk down the tunnel,
through an entire night of television replays, hoping that no one would ever look closely enough to prove it.
There is a second clue I should mention now, because it only made sense to me after this confession, sitting in that room. Earlier in the season, in a match I had not been involved in, but had heard about through the usual channels referees use to talk among themselves, Webb had been assigned to a Hartbridge away fixture and had specifically requested to be moved to a different match, citing a scheduling conflict that, according to the assignments office, had never actually existed. In that time, it had seemed like nothing more than ordinary administrative noise. In that room, with Cassidy's footage still frozen on the screen, it became the second piece of a pattern that had been building for longer than any of us had noticed. The third clue came from Webb himself, almost as an aside once the confession had properly started and there was nothing left to protect. He told us that in the tunnel after the match, before I had even reached the officials' room, Doyle had walked past him and said, quietly, that he hoped Webb could sleep that night. Webb said he had not understood at the time why those particular words from that particular player had unsettled him so badly that he had thrown up in the officials' toilet before speaking to anyone. He said it was only lying awake at 4 a.m, turning the whole day over in his head, that he had understood he was not going to be able to hold a lie for long, and that some part of him had already been preparing, without fully admitting it to himself, to tell the truth if anyone asked him properly. The panel suspended Webb from all officiating duties that morning, pending a full disciplinary hearing that would, some weeks later, end his career on the list permanently. He did not fight the outcome. He gave a full written statement, apologized to the board, to me, and eventually, through the board's own channels, to Hartbridge United directly. I was cleared of any wrongdoing myself, since I had followed correct protocol in trusting an assistant with a clearer sightline than my own. But Cassidy told me, and I have thought about his words many times since, that being procedurally correct and being at peace with the outcome are two very different things, and that I should not expect the second simply because the panel had confirmed the first. The result itself could not be changed. This is not a detail I am including for dramatic effect. It is simply how football works, and I want to be honest about it rather than pretend otherwise. Once a match has been played to its conclusion and the result has been recorded, the laws of the game do not allow it to be replayed or overturned because of a refereeing error, however serious, however well documented afterward. Astonfield Rovers remained champions. Hartbridge United remained a club that had been denied a title on the final kick of the season by a decision that turned out, in the clearest possible terms, to be wrong. The board issued a public statement acknowledging the error, naming no one directly, but confirming that disciplinary action had been taken against an assistant referee and offering what amounted to an apology that changed nothing about where the trophy sat.
I drove to Hartbridge's training ground myself 10 days after the panel's findings were made public, because I did not think an apology delivered through a press release was worth much to the people who had lost something. Reyes let me in without much warmth, which I understood and did not resent. Doyle was the one who agreed to speak with me in an empty meeting room that still had the club's promotion targets from 3 seasons earlier taped to the wall, an old reminder of smaller ambitions the club had long since outgrown. I told him everything Webb had told the panel. I told him I was sorry, not because I personally had lied to him, but because I had stood on that pitch and made the final call, and the responsibility for that call, whatever the circumstances behind it, would always sit with me in some measure that no protocol could fully absolve.
Doyle listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me only one thing. He asked whether Webb's brother had ever been told that a man carrying his old disappointment for 9 years had ended up costing an entire football club its championship because of it. I told him I did not know, that it was not something the board had shared with me, and that I doubted Webb himself would want it known. Doyle nodded slowly and said something I have not forgotten. He said that he understood, better than most people would expect, what it was like to carry an old wound quietly for years and let it decide things you never meant for it to decide. He said he was not ready to forgive Webb and that he did not think forgiveness was something he owed on any particular schedule. But he said he no longer needed to believe I had lied to him personally and that this, on its own, was worth something. Hartbridge United went into the playoffs 3 weeks later and lost narrowly in the semi-final, a defeat that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with a squad that had given everything it had across a long, exhausting season and simply had nothing left in the tank. Reyes stayed on as manager, Doyle stayed on as captain, and turned down, for a third time, an offer from a bigger club, telling a local newspaper only that he still believed there was something worth finishing at Hartbridge that had nothing to do with what had been taken from them in April. I was not sanctioned by the board, and I continued to officiate at the highest level I had reached before that match, but I asked the following season not to be considered for that particular fixture list again, and the board granted the request without asking why.
I still think, more often than I would like to admit, the difference between what 41,000 people believed they watched that afternoon and what had actually happened on that goal line. They believed I had made a bad call under pressure, the kind of human error that football has always lived with and always will. What had actually happened was smaller and, in its own way, sadder than that. One man, carrying a 9-year grief he had never properly examined, had made himself believe for less than a second that he was seeing justice instead of a boy losing his footing under a corner kick. Everything after that, the whistle, the penalty, the trophy, the headlines, the disciplinary hearing, was simply the size that one small human failure of honesty is capable of becoming when it is given a microphone and 41,000 witnesses at the worst possible moment to be wrong. I do not know if Marcus Webb has found any peace with what he did. I know that I have made my own uneasy peace with the part of it that belonged to me, which is smaller than the part that belonged to him, but is not nothing either. And I know that somewhere in a training ground in the north of England, a captain who was never given back his championship still puts on the same shirt every morning, still leads the same back line, and still, as far as I am aware, has never once asked the club to give him a reason to leave.